there's an astonishing lack of discernment in the charismatic movement. Aimee Semple McPherson, Sister Aimee, as she is known. She was the queen of the Pentecostal movement. From a little girl, she always wanted to be in theater, and she actually got her wish, because that's what she was. She married a guy named Robert Semple, and they went to China believing that once they got there, they would be given the gift of tongues. Of course, it didn't work out that way, and not only did it not work out that way, but her husband Robert died 2 months after they got to China. And then so she left China, returned to the United States, and she gave birth to her firstborn child. Of course, her father was dead. She married another guy named Harold McPherson, hence her name, Aimee Semple McPherson. And they moved to Chicago. But in Chicago, Aimee began to preach multiple nights per week. She was gone all the time, and she would leave the baby at home with her husband Harold to care for the kids. You see, role reversal, right? She should have been the one at home caring for the children. But no, she believed that the Holy Spirit wanted her to preach, despite the clear teachings of 1 Timothy chapter 2 and 3 and Titus chapter 2, where God calls women to be workers at home. But no, she was out on the preaching circuit. She left her husband with the kids all the time, absent mom. But this was all the leading of the Holy Spirit, right? No. She became a street preacher. Oddly, she would go out on the streets in some public place, public intersection, and she would just stand there and look up at the sky and stare blankly at the sky for a long time. And of course, other people would notice this and like, what's going on with this woman? And so a crowd would form. And then once a crowd gathered around, then she would kind of come to life and start preaching. Just very much in theater. She had preaching tours and healing meetings all across the country. She was a household name. She was a big deal back in her day. Everybody knew who Aimee Semple McPherson was, Sister Aimee. She started this church in Los Angeles called Angelus Temple. That's not a typo, it's the way it was spelled. And at the time, it was the largest church in the United States of America. You see, it's a massive building. This is a picture of the inside. And thousands and thousands and thousands of people would come to hear Sister Aimee preach. Very theatrical. This is a picture of her. One of her services, she actually rode a motorcycle down the aisle dressed as a female police officer. She was kind of like the early seeker-sensitive, kind of market-driven approach, entertainment-driven pastor. But she was, aside from her home life, which was a wreck and a disaster, she was also sexually immoral and a deceiver. One time, Aimee Semple McPherson just disappeared, and everybody thought, well, she must have been kidnapped or she's drowned or something. They looked for her body, and of course, she's out in California, so they figured maybe she drowned in the ocean. She just disappeared. Nobody knew where she was. Her husband didn't know where she was. Her mom didn't know where she was. Nobody. She just disappeared. Turns out she ran off with this guy, a guy who worked for her, and his name was Kenneth Ormiston, and they just ran off and had an affair is what happened. But she finally surfaced, and she had this elaborate story to try to cover up her sexual sin, and she said that she had been kidnapped by some Mexicans, took across the border into Mexico, and they tied her up in a shed somewhere, and she somehow managed to free herself from her bonds and escaped and got back into the United States. And she said, I'm here, I was kidnapped and all this. Well, her story fell apart real quickly because there were no bruises on her. She wasn't even dirty. Her clothes were clean. No evidence that she had been kidnapped and tied up in a shed. She was just covering up her sexual sin.